The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody. Welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Saturday, December 21st. We're inching, getting closer to Christmas. So, Merry Christmas. Christmas just a few days away. Hopefully, you guys are getting ready, buying presents, last minute shopping, stuff like that. Hopefully, you're having a great weekend. All right, today we're going to talk about. This will be a first, in I guess a series that we're going to do on how to rationally approach moving from where we are today towards freedom in a particular area. So today we're going to do finance. We're going to do healthcare at some point. We're going to do immigration at some point, and we'll probably do U.S. relationship with China at some point, right? As how do we move from where we are today towards freedom, towards what a rational, free market, constitutional, properly rights-respecting government would do. And as I said, today we're going to start with finance. Alexis sponsored the show. He's on with us live. That's great. Feel free, all of you, to ask questions as we go along, and let's see how this goes. Let me just note that that's him, Alexis. That's him on the chat. Anyway, let me note that I don't know if we're going to be able to do any of these in one show. I'm going to try, but complexity, there's massive amounts of complexity associated with regulation. And as a consequence, there's massive amounts of complexity associated with deregulation. I'll get to why that is, why you can't just wipe them all out. Why can't we just go, somebody put this up on some comment or some way. Why can't you just cancel all the regulations tomorrow? We'll just be freer and that'll be it. We'll have freedom. That's great. We'll be done. So we'll get to that. We'll get to that in the context of finance in a minute. Why you have to do it step by step, why you have to do it in a kind of a rational way. Now, I'm not going to give you all the steps because the reality is that this is going to have to be major work that somebody's going to have to do. This is a book-length treatment of how to do this when it comes to the details. The amount of regulations that apply to finance is so extensive that unwinding them is going to be a massive project that people are going to have to really figure out and do over, my guess is, several years. And they're going to have to find solutions to a variety of different problems. And it's going to be great when it happens, but it's going to be a lot of work. It's going to be complicated. And so I'm going to give the principles, some examples of why it's complicated, as we go through this. And of course, feel free to ask about specific examples as you think of them, as you come up with new examples. Please ask about them. But there's a lot here. We're talking about numerous regulatory agencies at the federal level, 6 or 7 or 8, and we're talking about regulatory agencies at the state level. Every state has significant regulations of finance. So there's state regulations, there's federal regulations, and there are multiple agencies that are responsible for these regulations. All of these need to be phased out and replaced with appropriate, rights-respecting, rights-protecting laws. And we'll talk about how we would think about all of that today. So that's what the show's going to be today. Again, feel free to ask questions about this. I guess you can ask questions about anything else if you want. We'll get to them last. But any questions about finance, any questions about financial deregulation, or any questions about finance broadly, will get priority today on the Super Chat. Don't forget the Super Chat. We still have to do a Super Chat. We still have to fund the shows, funding from listeners like you. Value for value. All right, so let's get started with finance. And I think the first thing to note about finance, and what I'll do with these shows is lay out the lay of the land as it exists today, approximately, so that we know what we're dealing with first. Finance is the most regulated industry in the world, in the United States. Finance is the first industry to really get regulated in the United States. Other countries were better than the US in finance, in terms of regulations. So from the very beginning of the Republic, banks in particular, finance more broadly, was regulated by primarily state regulations. The founders, particularly Jefferson, very suspicious of financial enterprises, and particularly large financial enterprises with a lot of financial and political power. And as a consequence, the nature of banking early on was to be fragmented and small. And so we'll get to that in a minute. So the first thing to remember is finance is the area that's been most regulated throughout history, right? So if food regulations of food started in the, I think the teens, financial regulations started, with the establishment of the United States. If environmental regulations are really a phenomenon of the 1970s, financial regulations are a phenomenon that goes back to the 18th century. And by the way, we're heavily part of FDR's attempts to completely restructure and change the U.S. economy. So you have, under FDR, you have the 1933 Act, you've got the Security and Exchange Act of 1934, and you've got the Investment Company Act of 1940, which is still 3 of the 4 to 5 major regulatory bills that dominate finance to this day. I'd add to those Dodd-Frank of 2010, I think. 2010 as basically the 4 big regulatory acts that govern basically modern finance. There've been some changes to them. There've been some pieces of them that have been deregulated. But for the most part, these regulatory bills from the 1930s, 1940, and 2010 basically are what run the financial world today, and they're what needs to be unwound if we're going to deregulate finance. But as I said, state regulations and some federal regulations date back to the 18th century. So finance, they've had a lot of time to regulate, to control, to manipulate, to change. Finance of all of them has some of the deepest regulations that go into every aspect of the business. In many respects, American banks are branches or of the U.S. government. They're extensions of the U.S. government. And it's not an accident that banks also benefit from massive bailouts and too big to fail, and financial institutions do, and banks in particular, and all of that stuff. Although now it's not just banks, it's financial institutions more broadly, have that. So length of time and complexity. Finance is a complex field. It deals with a lot of different things. Banks, traditional banks, corner that you have in the corner of the town, investment banks that deal in securities and underwriting securities and complex financial transactions. You got derivatives trading. You got security exchanges and trading. You've got variety of different financial markets, insurance companies, not just banks, but insurance companies, mortgage banks, mortgage securitization, and we could go on and on and on and on and on and on and on. I mean, auto loans have their own kind of little financial institutions, and they're securitized, and there's just no end to the number of different types of financial institutions, different types of financial products. And again, every single one of those, hedge funds, private equity funds, venture capital funds, every one of those has its own set of regulations that apply to it. So we're talking about a vast array, complex array of regulations. And when you talk about deregulations, we're going to have to separate a few things out, because deregulation will look differently if we're talking about banks. It would look differently if we're talking about securities markets, stock market, and the trading in the stock markets, the hedge funds, mutual funds, and other kind of funds, and the raising of money. That is the whole idea of a company going out and issuing shares and raising money. That is heavily regulated. That, by the way, is regulated by what's called blue sky laws, and a lot of that is regulated at the state level. And if you want to go public, you have to, and if you want to raise capital, you often have to file different regulatory paperwork in every single state. So 50 different pieces of paperwork, because the criteria by which you raise money in California and criteria by which you raise money in Connecticut are going to be different, right? So we've got all these different markets, and we're going to have to talk about deregulating, because they all serve different functions and they all have different consequences to how we deregulate. Now, because of this complexity, and because of the crucial role finance plays in an economy, the economy shuts down without finance. Finance is heavily correlated. Freedom in finance is heavily correlated with a successful economy. And sophistication in finance is heavily correlated with success economically. One of the things that can happen if the deregulation is wrong, done badly, or if it's done all at once, if tomorrow we wake up and say, no financial regulations, what are the consequences? Well, the reality is that most banks, 99.9, no, not 99, all banks, every single bank in the United States does not have enough liquidity to be able to deal with depositors asking for their money back, even a small portion of them. Because the way they're regulated, they are encouraged to keep on reserve very, very little of what you deposit at the bank. They're encouraged to lend and invest all the rest. And they are told that if they get into liquidity problems, then the Federal Reserve, or the regulatory agencies, if you will bail them out. And we, as depositors, for example, all assume that our money is safe in the bank because they all have deposit insurance, which is a government-created regulatory thing. And if that went away tomorrow, I would want my money out of the bank. All of us would want our money out of the bank. All of us would go to the bank and ask for our money out now, and the entire banking system would collapse. It would basically, the entire thing would go bankrupt in a day. What happened to Silicon Valley Bank would happen to every bank in the United States. It would crash the economy. It would crash the financial sector. It would grow far beyond banks. Businesses would want their money back suddenly. They wouldn't have it. They'd have to write it all down. Their bank would go bankrupt. the whole system would collapse. So we have created an unbelievably fragile system because of all the regulations. That is, the regulatory environment that we have today is a fragile regulatory environment. It's a fragile financial environment. What would happen tomorrow if all the regulations went away vis-a-vis stock trading? I don't even know. God, it would be such a mess. What rules would apply? What wouldn't apply? Basically, all the rules that dictate stock trading, who can trade, when you can trade, how much you can trade, and what circumstances you can trade, and what prices you can trade, are dictated by regulation. It can all be replaced by rules that are governed by the market. We can talk about how in a little bit. But that takes time. It doesn't, none of that happens in a day. So there's no question that the market would eventually organize itself. But the damage which would be done in the process would be unbelievably devastating and not necessary. Devastating and not necessary. That is, we can achieve freedom if we're just willing to be patient, 2, 3, 4 years max, without the damage. And that's what we should strive for. It might be impossible. There might be some damage anyway. But we want to try to move to a system of rights, of right protection, of property rights protection, without a complete upheaval of the entire system. Think about all the contracts that are written. Just think about it this way. All the contracts that are written between investors, investment companies, depositors, and banks that assume explicitly and often implicitly a particular regulatory structure. A particularly regulatory structure. It's just unfair to all the market participants. All your risk assessments, all your planning, all the thinking you've done about your finances are all made under the assumption that at least this regulatory regime that exists today to some extent is going to be with us. And if it's gone, everything has to change, everything. So I am for sunsetting regulations in a particular order and with a known date for when they go away so that markets can adapt to their disappearance. And before all that happens, you know, you've got a chance to build institutions, relationships, contracts, basically market-driven rules of conduct that are consistent with rights or consistent with the market that replace many of the regulations or those regulations that are kind of necessary. Okay, so an option where you just get rid of all the regulations tomorrow is just too chaotic and too unjust. It's unjust. So there has to be a process, and the question is, how do we do the process, and how do we define the process, and how do we engage it? Now, some things can be done pretty quickly, right? Some things can be done pretty quickly. I'll give you an example. Hedge funds. Hedge funds are, pools of money that are being put together in order to trade, and they were originally put together in order to trade free of regulation. That is, the idea was that the people who invested in hedge funds were sophisticated investors. There were not going to be a lot of them. It's just going to be a few people. They had a lot of money invested, so they had a lot of experience, and they had a lot of investable income, so that they were relatively rich, so they could afford to lose some money. And so hedge funds were set up as financial institutions to get around the various regulations that existed. To give you some examples, okay? So in order to get around the public offering registration requirements of the Securities Act of 1933, right? And the reporting requirements of the Securities Act of 1934, and the registration requirements of the Investment Company Act of 1940, right? The hedge funds, again, as I said, only took what's called private offerings. It wasn't a public offering. It wasn't marketed. There was no general solicitation and general advertising. They exempted themselves by agreeing, basically, we're not going to do any marketing. And to the extent that we inform people about this, it's only to accredited investors, institutional investors, insiders, people who have $5 million or more of investable securities. So a whole variety of conditions were self-imposed by hedge funds in order to allow them to get around the regulations. And they thrived. Hedge funds did very, very well. And during the 1980s and 1990s, first hedge funds were started in the 1950s. They did pretty well in the 60s, but then they really came into their own in the 1980s and in the 90s. The first hedge fund billionaires were really, made during the 80s and 90s. And the industry as a whole grew dramatically during this period. Maybe the most famous hedge fund at the time was George Soros, maybe the most to this day, who ran a hedge fund that did what's called today macro investing, or did a lot of foreign exchange investing, and basically made a lot of money on betting on particular currencies. Betting is not the right word, but kind of predicting the direction and helping the direction happen, helping prices move in various currencies around the world. And so it's made billions and billions and billions of dollars during this period. Again, everything about hedge funds was structured to avoid regulations. They avoid not just the investment company regulations, but also the Commodity Futures Trading Commission regulations, and on and on and on and on you could go, and how they found ways to get around this. So much of the way hedge funds functioned in the early days, in terms of raising money, structuring internal operations, was in an attempt to avoid all regulations. And they succeeded to a large extent. To a large extent, 80s and 90s, hedge funds were relatively unregulated. And again, they did phenomenally well, and they made a lot of money, and hedge fund managers made a lot of money. A typical hedge fund historically would get compensated 2% of the amount of money under management plus 20% of all the profits. Some managers they did so well, could get away with 4% of the money under management and 40%, 40, of the profits. And it was a beautiful thing. If a hedge funds, people can take their money in and out of a hedge fund fairly quickly. The money's not locked up, typically in a hedge fund. So if you don't perform, people withdraw their money. You close the hedge fund, you're gone. If you do perform, more money flows in, you might be able to create additional instruments, and you do phenomenally well. It's incredibly performance-based. Compensation is 100% is 100% at the end of the day performance-based, because even the percentage of the amount of money you have in the management is performance-based, because the amount of money under management is going to be determined by whether people want to invest in you or not. That is whether people think you're performing well or not. So it's a dynamic industry in which hedge funds disappear and hedge funds come into being constantly, all the time. But of course, regulators don't like that. Regulators don't like that. They don't like the fact that it's, independent of them. They don't like the fact that, there's a whole world out there that they have no control over. And so from the beginning, they've been trying to regulate it. And in 1985, the SEC, put in the first regulations of hedge funds. They found an interpretation of the Investment Advisors Act that for the purposes of an exemption from registration under that act, the safe harbor allowed a limited partnership rather than each of its limited partners to be counted as a client of a general. Anyway, it just gets complicated. But they started imposing rules. So, and in 1997, the SEC broadened the scope of certain rules to regulate it even more. And then in 1998, if you remember, Long-Term Capital Management, LTCM, went bankrupt and was bailed out by a consortium of other hedge funds and other investors at the orchestration of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, Alan Greenspan, basically. And now there was fear that hedge funds were, quote, systemic, that if they failed, they would drag down the entire financial system. And now the incentive to regulate it increased even more. So that by 2004, the SEC tried to use its rulemaking authority to force hedge funds to register. In 2006, the Supreme Court ruled that as outside the scope of the law, as arbitrary, and all the hedge funds that had registered deregistered. But then in 2010, Dodd-Frank was passed, and as part of Dodd-Frank, you have the Private Fund Investment Advisors Registration Act, PFIARA, whatever, which basically authorizes the SEC to bring hedge funds under regulatory supervision. And since then, there's just a mountain of regulations that are being imposed on the hedge fund industry by the SEC. And it just goes on and on, right? Now, it's still true, though, for example, that hedge funds, investments in hedge funds are dominated by what you'd call sophisticated investors. It's mainly wealthy individuals and pension plans and insurance companies, and although if it's an insurance company and a pension plan, and the fund has to be consistent with ERISA, which is, anyway, it gets more and more complicated. But the point is that you could deregulate hedge funds tomorrow, pretty quickly, in other words, pretty quickly, without much collateral damage, without much damage more broadly. So you could basically repeal what's called Title IV of Dodd-Frank, which is the Private Fund Investment Advisor Registration Act. You could repeal that. You could repeal the 1997 SEC rule. You could appeal the 1985 SEC rule, and basically return the hedge fund industry to the way it was before then. And now, you could do that very quickly. You could do that, if you passed the laws and all of that, you could do that within a month. And you'd hear a huge sigh of relief. But there would be no real, that I can think of, downside in terms of consequences in the marketplace. Now, the question, of course, is why would you do that? Why would you deregulate them without deregulating everything else? And I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that could be a step. And that could be an easy one and a quick one. Just do that. Okay, now next. Mutual funds. Mutual funds invest under very limited, under huge constraints, often in similar securities to hedge funds. But mutual funds are heavily regulated by all those investment acts going up back to 1933. Again, you could probably deregulate mutual funds, maybe with the exception of money market mutual funds. So money markets would have to be put aside. But stock mutual funds, bond mutual funds, you could do those fairly quickly. You could just slowly undo those pieces of the regulatory regimes from Dodd-Frank all the way back to 1933 that apply to mutual funds. Disclosure requirements. Do you know that by law, mutual funds are not allowed to pay their managers a % of the profit? They can only pay them a salary. So you would slowly unwind that, right? You would slowly get rid of all the regulations that restricted mutual funds. And in a sense, you could probably do this within a year. You would take away everything that makes a mutual fund special and different than a hedge fund, because mutual funds, for example, are not allowed to sell securities short. Hedge funds can. But if you took away the requirements, you would basically create a situation where the hedge fund industry and the mutual fund industry, there was really no difference between them. And if you took away all the regulations that restricted who you can raise money from and so on, now hedge funds could raise money from regular people just like mutual funds do. And basically you would have one big investment industry that would evolve in completely new directions and completely new ways that would not be like what we have today, and that would basically be marketing different products. They're plain vanilla, regular index fund products, all the way to sophisticated long-short macro models where most people invested in the funds didn't really understand what they were doing, but they were okay with that. And the market would evolve. So I would say I would take a year, and within a year, the goal would be to create a situation where mutual funds and hedge funds were all basically, in terms of the regulation, the same. And the reason I would take a year is to give people time to adjust. A lot of investors, so for example, there's a lot of disclosure requirements, both for hedge funds and for mutual funds. Hedge funds is less important because investors know what they're getting into. But mutual funds, people expect certain disclosures and being able to track and so on. And you want to give them time to get their money out, or you want to give them the mutual funds time to figure out what the best disclosure practices are and how they want to market it. So I would say, okay, in 12 months, here are all the things that are going away, regulatory-wise, for mutual funds and for hedge funds. And after that, we will be, I'll tell you in a minute what we'll be tracking, but after that, there'll be one investment marketplace in which that can sell you investment products, whatever they happen to be. You'd probably include in this private equity funds, venture capital funds, private equity funds as well cannot. They're all regulated in different ways, but all of these investment funds should be basically free of regulation and then allowed to innovate in terms of how they want to offer their product to the public, how they want to explain it, how they want to market it. And the only thing that the government needs to be aware of and needs to be diligent about and needs to needs to track is this. What is the role of government in financial markets? The role of government in financial markets is to protect us against fraud. That is it. To protect us against fraud. Promises that are detached from reality, commitments that are not done, Bernie Madoff pyramid-like schemes. That is it. And one of the things the regulators should spend a year doing is figuring out what replaces all these regulations as a form of fraud protection, monitoring for fraud. And it can't be disclosure requirements. You have to disclose all these things. It has to be some objective criteria by which the disclosure, whatever it happens to be, matches reality. And what constitutes fraud and what doesn't. And that is not going to be easy. It's not obvious what fraud is. Fraud is a complicated violation of rights. Not always straightforward. So they would have to really spend time setting up a set of rules, laws, that define clearly what constitutes fraud in financial transactions. And what they're going to do about trying to detect it and going after the fraudsters. So I think in the section of investment institutions, hedge funds, mutual funds, private equity funds, venture funds, so on, it's relatively easy. You don't expect massive mayhem, although because the public is involved with mutual funds, there'll be a lot of people unsettled and confused and not to know what they do. And here, hopefully, there'll be financial advisors and there'll be financial advisory firms that find ways to help them out and guide them through the process. And that should be the role of financial advisors, is to help people deal with the complexity of finance, help people deal with how to structure their portfolios in a way that makes sense. So I think from the perspective of investment companies, it's relatively simple to deregulate. As we move deeper into finance, deeper in the sense of to the institutions, it becomes a lot harder. So let's go one step in. Today, everything to do with how we buy and sell stock, not just in terms of how we buy and sell stock, everything we have to do in terms of buying and selling stock is regulated, is controlled. What you can, what stocks you're allowed to buy, depending on who you are, under what conditions you can buy them, in what markets can you buy them, who can sell them to you, how are they advertised, marketed, all of that is regulated. How the exchanges should behave, the exchanges is where you buy and sell the stock, how IPOs, initial public offerings, should happen, regulated. Blue sky laws at the state level dictate how private companies can sell stock, raise money. And to some extent, one of the things we would need to do in finance generally is to federalize finance. Get rid of federalism, get rid of state regulations, state controls over much of this, so that we can liberate it all at once. Not just liberate it at the federal level, but liberate it completely, including the state level. And that's another complexity for the whole thing. So one of the things that's going to have to happen with regard to stock markets, for example, bond markets, other institutions that facilitate trade, is that they're going to have to be reconstituted as truly private entities. That is, the regulations that apply to them have to go away. That includes, for example, all the disclosure regulations that have to do with public companies. So, you know, public companies have to file disclosures. They have to file annual reports and income statements, and they have to do it by a particular form of accounting standards, and they have to do it by a certain date, and it has to be audited, and there's no end to the they have to provide information, and they have to provide all kinds of information. Every change in management, every change in board of directors, every significant change in ownership has to be disclosed. I mean, the amounts of paper luckily it's all electronic today, that of disclosures is unbelievable. The whole departments, massive, hundreds of people in charge of disclosure at publicly traded corporations. All of that dictated by government. Now, some of that makes sense. That is, public companies, I own a stock in a public company, I would like to know what's going on. And the regulating body that should be regulating these kind of things is the exchange on which the company is listed, the stock is listed, in which I buy and sell. They should say, you want to trade on the New York Stock Exchange. These are the qualifications. This is what you have to do. Your company has to disclose X, Y, Z. Every company on the New York Stock Exchange has similar disclosure requirements, has to use certain acceptable accounting standards, has to do all these things. And why does the New York Stock Exchange care? Because what the New York Stock Exchange wants to do is optimize trading. It wants to maximize the amount of money they make from me and you trading stocks on their exchange. And I will only trade in stocks where I have some information about the value of these stocks, or what they're doing, or why they're doing it, and I want some information. So it's in the exchange interest to make sure that the company's listed on that exchange, traded on an exchange, get information, provide the information. So again, you would need to allow time when you got rid of all these disclosure regulations that are in the 34 Securities Act and the 1940 Act. In getting rid of all that, you need to give time for the market to replace them with exchange-based regulations. Regulations here in the positive sense of market regulating. Now here again, here's a complexity. Right now, there are regulations that say that basically wherever you list your stock, wherever you IPO, you do an initial public offering, all exchanges get to trade all stocks. But that's just an arbitrary regulatory thing that it actually goes against the incentives of the exchanges. Exchanges should want to specialize in only trading certain stocks, and therefore have requirements on those companies to have disclosure and all of the rest, right? So the whole structure of the markets would probably have to change. And that might take time for exchanges to figure out which companies they want to keep and which companies they don't keep, and what they want to trade and what they don't want to trade. Suddenly they have freedom to make those decisions. And again, what I would do is say, you've got a year. You've got a year to figure that out. In a year, these laws, all these disclosure laws, all the laws governing how exchanges should work, all the laws regulating exchanges, all of them go away. And we have a free market in stock trading and bond trading. And you could make that coincide with the same time that investment managers suddenly become free. And the market will have a year to dramatically and fast and quickly realign itself, adjust completely. And of course, it'll continue adjusting after that year, but it'll have a year to prepare for freedom. for being completely free. And it'll be a beautiful thing, by the way. It'll be amazing to watch the human mind liberated to figure out the best way to organize financial markets and institutions. I mean, wow, that would be so cool. The best way to trade securities, the best way to make investments, the best way to raise money, the best structures for this, and new structures will be invented. Because a lot of the structures that exist today, whether it's an LLC or partnership or all of that is, some of it's dictated by tax law, a lot of it is dictated by regulatory law. And once those regulations go away, people will become incredibly innovative. All right. And it'll be very different than it was before the regulations came into being. Because the technology is different. The possibilities are different. The kind of transactions are different. And the innovation, think about, I mean, it's sad to think that we haven't had 70 years of innovation in financial structures. Most of the innovation in finance over the last 70 years, 80, 90 years, 90 years, no, 100 years, 90 years, over the last 90 years has been to find ways to get around regulations. And suddenly, all of that would be liberated to now we get to actually think about how to innovate in order to better serve our customer, better, make more money, make more, allocate capital more effectively, figure out better ways to trade, come up with new technologies that make trading even faster or better, or prices reflect better information, whatever, right? You get innovation that is now focused on efficiency, on productivity, on money making, on profit making, rather than innovation that is focused on all of that in the context of regulation. And the best way, of course, to make money is to get around the regulation. The best way to increase efficiency is to get around the regulation. So much of the complexity we see in financial markets today is driven by the need to get around regulations. No way is that more the case than in banking. Banking is the most complicated to deregulate, the most risky to deregulate, the one that has the most impact on the most people, because almost all of us have money in a bank. It's why banks, but not a lot of other financial institutions, have deposit insurance, although we'll talk about too big to fail in a minute, because that applies to a lot of different institutions. And then the question is, how do we deregulate banks? So here's the principle for all of these, right? The principle for deregulation has to be move towards freedom as quickly as possible, freedom being less to no regulations, as quickly as possible, without creating unnecessary chaos and financial disaster, and while continuing to protect against fraud. So the principle that should guide all regulations is move towards freedom, less regulations to no regulations, without creating unnecessary chaos and financial disaster, while continuing to protect individuals against fraud. That's my best formulation of the principle by which should guide regulations. Deregulation, primarily in the financial sector. Right? Yeah, 1 year sunset for a lot of this is quick, but is doable. Banking, it's going to be a little longer because you're going to have to do this in phases, I suspect, and you're going to have to give people a heads up about what is coming. So one of the things the 1933 Act did is establish deposit insurance. Deposit insurance basically guarantees that up to a certain amount of your deposits in the bank, there is a fund that is supposedly funded by the premiums that banks pay into this fund that will pay you off if the bank cannot pay you. What we've seen in history is ultimately standing behind this fund is the U.S. government. The U.S. government basically is guaranteeing your money in the bank up to a certain amount. That amount historically was $10,000. It was then raised to $50,000, then to $100,000, more recently to $250,000. And then what we've seen in 2008 and then again with Silicon Valley Bank is that the actual limit for the amount of money that the government is guaranteeing in the bank is everything. It's unlimited. And that is explicitly the case in financial institutions, banks that the government has deemed too big to fail. Those financial institutions, everything is guaranteed by the government. Now, this creates lots of problems. It creates what's called moral hazard, which is an incentive for banks to take on more risk than they would otherwise take because the downside is protected by the government and the upside the bank benefits from. And this is clearly what's happened. On top of that, the government also sets things like reserve requirements, capital requirements, and those don't turn out to be just like minimum requirements. You can have more, but competition basically drives everybody to the lowest common denominator. At the end of the day, whatever the minimal reserve requirements, that's how much money the bank has to put aside from the money that you deposit in that they cannot loan out, all banks basically have almost the same deposit ratio, reserve ratio. All banks have about the same amount of capital, all at the very minimal that the government requires, not much more than that. If they hold more than that, they're at a competitive disadvantage versus the competition. Because deposit insurance, we as depositors, the providers of financing to the bank, have no incentive to care about how risky the bank is. So all banks maximize the risk. All banks maximize leverage because there's nobody to discipline them. We, the depositors, who should be disciplining them, don't. So if you get rid of deposit insurance first, the whole thing collapses. So you can't do that. So how do you deregulate banks? How do you deregulate banks? Well, step one is you have to let all banks know the deposit insurance is going away. Let's say 2 years from now. In 2 years, there is no deposit insurance. You can replace it with private deposit insurance if you can find that. You cannot replace it. You can do as you will. But between now and 2 years from now, you have to get ready for the position where there is no deposit insurance. In the meantime, we are going to deregulate different aspects of the banking environment. Now, a big part of what caused a lot of problems in banking originally was the fact that there were heavy regulations against bank mergers. Banks were not allowed to merge out of state, sometimes out of county, and banks were fragmented and small. A lot of that has gone away. That is, the regulations that bars that was basically taken away in 1996. Sorry, 1994. But it's still true that every bank merger has to be approved by the regulators, by FDIC and the OCC and all these other regulations. What needs to happen is, first of all, basically these regulatory agencies need to be told that they must approve all bank mergers. Government should have no say whether a bank can merge or not. They should all be allowed to merge. So that's step one. We want larger financial institutions. So they have to be able to merge. They have to be able to merge and grow. They have to be able to do more things than they're allowed to do today. Banks are very restricted in what kind of loans they make, what kind of securities they can invest in. That all needs to be loosened up. So banks need the freedom to be able to do a lot more with the capital that they have, the money being deposited with them. So all of these loosening up regulations, they need to be phased in over these 2 years. So that in 2 years, deposit insurance goes away. At that point, you would expect banks to have increased the amount of capital that they have. You'd expect banks to increase the amount of reserves that they have. To the extent that private deposit insurance becomes available, you would expect banks to acquire that insurance. You'd also probably expect that to come about, to develop a variety of different rating agencies that rank banks on how risky they are. So we as depositors know whether our bank is a highly rated bank, a low rated bank, a high risk bank, a low risk bank, so that we can make judgments about whether we should take our money out or not. And those ratings would come into force before deposit insurance goes away. But I think with deposit insurance, you need a little bit more time. You need 2-3 years. You'd have to really play it out before it is completely gone. And of course, with deposit insurance, the whole idea of too big to fail has to go. You know, there's a regulatory agency now created by Dodd-Frank that is responsible for establishing which institutions in the United States are too big to fail, and then establishing new regulations on them and new disclosure requirements and stress tests on them to be able to monitor them and assess their riskiness. All of that has to go away. So you would, within 3 years, have a banking sector that was completely free. Now, here's one more complication. One more complication. And that is that as long as you have a central bank, banks are not free. As long as you have a central banks, you know, it's going to be very difficult to have a truly free banking system. So I'm not going to get into it today. We can do it separately. But one of the things you would have to do over those 3 years is basically get rid of the Fed and then convert to a truly free banking system. A truly free banking system in which banks are also responsible for currency, for money, and what money is, and have the market develop that as well. And again, you need to give it time to be able to do that. Practically, some of the ways you would go around this is the lowest hanging fruit. The lowest hanging fruit, really, is to deregulate by starting with the most recent laws, right? We did okay before there was Dodd-Frank. So I would say within the first 100 days of a presidency, repeal Dodd-Frank. Just get rid of Dodd-Frank. That would do a lot to liberate hedge funds. It would do a lot to liberate banks, to reduce certain regulatory burdens from banks. It would just put us in the same position as we were in before Dodd-Frank, before 2010. And no disaster there. I mean, we had the financial crisis 2008, but that was a unique set of circumstances which we wouldn't have immediately following that. And then look at the 1940s. You know, there are all kinds of other regulatory bills in between, but just go sequentially and just get rid of them one at a time. Now, you could look at particular parts of them and deregulate, get rid of those pieces, right? And this is the sense in which also deregulation has to happen at the level of Congress. It has to happen at the level of legislation. It cannot happen by executive order. It cannot happen at the FDIC. And once you get, for example, to 1933, you would get rid of the FDIC. 1933, by getting rid of the 1933 securities law, you would get rid of the deposit insurance. So you would literally repeal these laws. Now, if there's any aspect of any particular law that was necessary to preserve in order to protect us from fraud, that would be involved. But think about it. 1934 bill, repealing that would get rid of the SEC. 33 would get rid of the FDIC. You'd have to have something special to get rid of the OCC, because the OCC, which is the Office of Control of the Currency, is a remnant of a law that was passed during the during the Civil War. So you'd have to have a special law getting rid of the OCC. The CFPB would go as part of Dodd-Frank. So as you got rid of these laws, as you reversed these laws, the regulatory agencies would fall away. And if you basically did this on a schedule, right, from, let's say we've got 3 years, start with Dodd-Frank, and then there's some bills in between that you could get rid of that had to do with S&Ls and other things that you would get rid of. And then you would ultimately get to the 1940s Investment Company Act, the 1934 Securities Exchange Act, and the 1933 Act. And by the time you ended with the 1933, most of banking would be done with. You'd still have to deal with the fact that you had a central bank, and but you could probably unwind that over that period as well. And by the end of this process, by the end of the 3 years, have a completely free banking system and a completely unregulated financial industry. And just have a schedule in advance. Let the world know. This is really important. What do you call it? Visibility, transparency. Really, really, really crucial in all deregulation, because you want the market to be able to respond. You want the market to be able to understand what you're doing, know exactly when everything is going to happen, and adapt to it. Adapt to it. Right? All right, what am I missing? What have I not covered? And then you would create one special entity, the Financial Fraud Agency, whose only responsibility was catch financial fraud. And the only reason you'd create a special agency, you wouldn't just be part of the FBI or something, is because, financial fraud can be sophisticated, complex, and it requires certain skills to be able to identify fraud and to be able to prove fraud and prosecute fraud. So that would be the reason you would, that's the one agency you would create as the SEC, the FDIC, the OCC, the CFPB, even the various futures and derivatives regulatory agencies would go, although some of those were created in a sense by the private sector, they were created by the exchanges. And they were voluntary, and you could maybe see some of the things that maybe the SEC does are now being done by the exchanges. And maybe they create agencies to monitor at the exchange level what is happening. But then it's all done voluntarily. It's all done in the marketplace. It has no involvement of government. What is the OFAC? Office of what? Tell me what it stands for, and I'll tell you whether it stays or gone. Almost everything goes. Every alphabet agency ultimately goes. But except the policing function of government, which might require a special agency just because of the expertise. Office of Foreign Asset Controls. I assume so. Part of this ultimately will also mean, there's all of those regulations. Sanctions regulations. Ultimately, the answer to that is it should go. The U.S. government has no right to sanction foreign individuals. Without a court trial, it just takes their assets. It just freezes their assets. By what right? It can deal with other governments as it sees fit. But by what right does it actually freeze the assets of particular individuals? It seems completely wrong to me, right? I get the intent, penalize those evil oligarchs. But without a court, without a trial, without any due process, you just take their assets? She could tell them they're not welcome in the United States and they could take their assets and invest them somewhere else. But I don't think a lot of these sanctions are legitimate. But I would view all of that as something that relates to foreign policy more than it relates to financial regulations. Now, regulations of transfers to and from foreign banks, no, there should be no regulation of that. It's none of the government's business. Ultimately, money laundering laws should go away. It's not the job of a bank to monitor the funds, whether the funds are gangsters' funds or innocent civilian funds. None of the bank should not violate privacy laws. The bank doesn't know if it's a gangster and shouldn't be required to get information to figure it out. All those laws, which are relatively new, should go away. Should go away. All the idea of you can't hold money in a Swiss bank account, you can't put money in a Cayman bank account, all that should go away. And we can consider tax-wise what to do about stuff like that, but that's a tax policy issue. And there are all kinds of ways in which we can make sure that that is minimal by lowering taxes and simplifying the tax code. Right. So, yeah. All right. So first I'm going to ask Alexis, if he's on the chat, if he has anything that he thinks I haven't covered or anything that I've gone over too quickly. One way, as I said, one way to deregulate finance is to do it by the order by which the regulations were passed, reverse order, the latest first. And do it, but importantly, do it on a predetermined, pre-publicized schedule so everybody knows what's coming. All right, so if you have any questions around this, anything around finance, financial regulations, how they unwound, all of that, feel free to ask. I'll give those questions a priority. Let's start with Alexis, and then if Alexis wants to comment, since he sponsored the show, I want to make sure I covered the material that he wanted me to cover. And whether I went in enough detail or any of that. Alexis says, is the fact that finance was regulated first related to the larger materialistic skeptic philosophical trend, as it is a more abstract industry and the culture is suspicious of conceptual activities? Yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which that's true. I think it has to do with, a lot of it has to do with the economic ignorance of the role the finance plays. I mean, the country was founded in 1776. The understanding of finance in the late 18th century was not very good. There were a few good thinkers, Turgot in France, Adam Smith, but none of them really got it. None of them had a theory of banking. None of them had a theory of banking as it integrates to a monetary theory, a theory of money. And they didn't really understand banks, and they were a little afraid of them. And they had also seen that banking in Europe had been captured by the state. So they were worried that big banks would then be used by a future American state for statist goals, which they have been, by the way. American banks have been used like that by the state, the bigger banks and the smaller banks, to do all kinds of things. Community reinvestment acts. There's another one that would be gone, right? If you went back, all the different, so you'd have to get rid of the Community Reinvestment Act as part of the process. That you could do. That's the kind of thing you could do day one. That's the kind of act that you could get rid of first 100 days. So I think the hostility towards finance came from, one, a deep lack of understanding of it. And then as we go through the 19th century, there is an ever-growing suspicion of capitalism, an ever-growing suspicion of conceptual activity, but also just of capitalism, an ever-growing suspicion of freedom. So as we get further away from the founding or further away from the Enlightenment, it becomes more and more difficult to justify, explain, understand the role of freedom and the role of free markets and the role of free markets as they apply to finance in the world out there. And therefore, more and more and more regulations are loaded on without really anybody arguing against them. Partially because there was no economic defense of finance, and partially because there was no moral defense of finance, and partially because, as you say, there was no trust in this abstract value creation. And they all integrate. People don't understand because they don't want to understand. People don't understand because they're suspicious of. All driven by rotten philosophy that spreads during the 19th century through Europe and then into the United States. So it was regulated first because it was the least understood and the least appreciated activity of all economic activities. Andrew, are the crusaders for regulation, like Elizabeth Warren, intellectually honest, even in the sense of being honestly blinded by altruism? Or are they motivated by nihilism and envy? Well, I think that's a false alternative, right? I think they're fundamentally dishonest because they're evading, but I don't think that they are motivated by an explicit nihilistic motivation. That is, Elizabeth Warren does not want to see our economy burn. She does not want to see it destroyed. That's not what she holds in her mind as her motivation. She holds in her mind that, look, it's a disaster. Look at inequality. Look at how unfair it is. Look at how finance discriminates. Look at how it perpetuates the rich being the rich and it doesn't help the poor. Look at how ill-informed people are about finance, and yet they're expected to participate in the game. I'm going to correct that by regulating and enforcing disclosure and making it fairer. And so I don't think that's honest in a sense that to come to all those conclusions, she has to evade. The evasion, if you will, is motivated by altruism. That is true. So I think she's dishonest without being nihilistic. I don't think her motivation is nihilistic. But she's definitely guided by dishonesty, by evasion, and by certainly an egalitarian-like attitude towards life, towards economics at least. All right, let me thank Wes. Thank you for the $50 sticker. Gail, thank you for the sticker. I think I saw another $50 here. Yeah, Adri, thank you for the $50 sticker. Really appreciate that. Mike, thank you for the $20 sticker. So thank you to all the stickers, all the supporters of the show. Really, really appreciate that. Of course, most of our thanks, my thanks today, are to Alexis, who sponsored this show, who I don't think is on the chat anymore, but I'm sure we'll listen to the show later on. Okay, David, $50 question. Based on the premise that regulation protects the uneducated, does the ubiquitous availability of AI help close the education gap? Does it introduce a capacity of regulation of consumer, maybe self-regulation? I mean, it's certainly another tool that's available very cheaply to investors and the public to educate themselves about what they are doing. So to the extent that people are concerned about uneducated investors, I don't think that's ever really been the case. I don't think any regulation is actually really sincerely motivated by that. Going back to Elizabeth Warren primarily is motivated by altruism and power. She wants control. She wants government to have control. She believes in government control. She rationalizes that through these kind of explanations about the uneducated masses. But yes, AI has the potential to close the education gap, to make it cheap and easy for people to get educated about finance, about complex issues, complex things. But the question is, will they use them, those tools? And as long as the attitude is they have, it's we cannot let them trade unless they're educated, then the government is never going to trust the people to educate themselves and will always impose some form of regulation. If only, well, you have to take this 10-hour course with an AI before you can make an investment. Like all the investment advisor requirements, for example, for me to advise you, I have to get trained. All of that would also go away, by the way, when we deregulated. So I think there've always been tools. There've always been ways by which, but it's true that technology is making those tools cheaper, more available, easier, and the excuses that these tools are not available to me go away. Now, what about then the next level, which is the government saying they might have the tool to educate themselves, but they're just too stupid. They're not smart enough. We're trying to protect people from their low IQ. I don't know what you do about that. Maybe that chip in the brain that Elon Musk is working on to make them smarter. But people will always find excuses to justify the regulation. So I don't think it was ever about the uneducated, unknowledgeable masses. I think that was just a rationalization. I think AI makes that less credible in the sense that everybody now has access to this. The government, the authorities, the regulators will just find another excuse, another rationalization. And partially is people are too stupid to understand what the AI teaches them. Thank you, David. Thank you for the $50. Really, really appreciate the support. Barbara, thank you for the sticker. Incredible. Thank you. All right, let's go over some of these. A nascent. What do you? Wait a minute. Let's wait on that. That's Brazil. That's the UN. Andrew says, I know regulatory capture is real, but it's too often used as a smear against big business. The government has a gun to their heads. What are they supposed to do but deal? Absolutely. And, Dodd-Frank is a good example of this. Dodd-Frank was this law that was passed as a shell, handed over to regulators and said, fill in the content of the regulations. And now it's hard and it's complicated. So the regulators went to the bankers and said, okay, let's figure out what should be in here. And you could say, oh, this is completely captured, and it is to some extent. But they're going to be controlled. A gun is pointed at them, and they want to minimize the damage. And does that include protecting themselves against competition? Sure. But the fault there is with Congress and the regulators. And, regulatory capture is inevitable in every regulatory regime, partially because regulators are not smart enough and they have to have industry input. And sometimes it happens through explicit fraud, through explicit, corruption. Sometimes the corruption is more implicit. I'll hire you when you leave your regulatory job. I'll give you a nice salary then. And it's never even spoken, it's just implied. So regulatory capture is a feature, not a bug of regulation. It's a feature, not a bug of regulation. You want to get rid of regulatory capture, get rid of regulation. And don't blame the business, blame the government. Megan says, Peter, welcome home, love. Wow, not in a, no puzzle, no clever rhyming, just straight out there. Welcome home. All right. Matt says, how does the Great Depression factor in? Is regulation necessary because economic collapse like this is possible, or does regulation cause a collapse? Well, in a sense, neither, right? So, but something causes the collapse. So the pattern is, and this is true of the Great Depression, some government action, some government control causes a collapse. That's what happened in the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve's mismanagement, Smoot-Hawley, raising taxes, all of that caused the Great Depression. Biggest villain there was the Federal Reserve. And the tariffs, right? Restrictions on trade. But the world, the intellectuals, many economists, blame the stock market for the collapse. So the response to collapse is not to get rid of the Fed. The response to collapse is to regulate finance because they're blamed for it. So then you have a massive quantity of regulations, 1933 bill, 1934 bill, all, really with the perspective of this is to prevent the next Great Depression. Because these institutions, stock markets, banks, caused the Great Depression. They didn't. Nobody today thinks they did. They didn't. But it's a great opportunity for, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Let's regulate, let's control, let's increase our power. Then these new regulations cause some crisis in the future. In the case of the 33, 34, and 40 regulations, they caused a crisis 64 years later. In 2008, they caused a great financial crisis. I mean, other things helped, but they did. I mean, if you think about those laws also created Freddie and Fannie, or at least Freddie. those, or maybe it was Fannie. I can't remember which one came first. Anyway, they created one of those. They created the whole mortgage industry. They created SNLs. They created the whole 30-year mortgage idea. The regulations created the setup for the 2008 Great Financial Crisis. That happens. The blame is not then placed on those ancient regulations that caused it. The blame is not placed on, oh no, it's the freedom that was left in the gaps between those regulations. There was no, I don't know what overheating is. So you get Dodd-Frank, 2010, which is supposed to close these, but Dodd-Frank creates basically the framework for the next crisis. And to some extent, all of these regulations created the S&L crisis of the 1980s and created the failure of Silicon Valley Bank and the crisis that created a couple of years ago. All of that is part of these ancient regulations. So they might create stability for a little while. Ultimately, they cause damage. And the damage is always blamed not on the regulation, but on the market, on that element that is still free. So that's the way it happens. Regulations cause depressions, which lead to more regulations, which cause more crises, which leads to more regulations, which causes more crises, which leads to more regulations, and on and on and on it goes. Okay. Enric says, why was the first Bank of the United States followed with the Bank of North America? Fine as created by Congress. So was the first Bank of the United States followed with the Bank of North America fine as created by Congress and should not have been ended? No, it was not fine. They had way too much federal government involvement. What was fine about them is that they were attempts to create a national charter for a bank versus the way banking was really until 1994, which was state chartered. Everything was at the state level, which created a fragmented and fragile banking system in the United States. So what should have happened is that the first Bank of the United States should have been just a model charter for a charter for a U.S. bank that could have branches and operate anywhere in the U.S. with no state restrictions on it. It should have been divorced from the government, from the federal government, which the first Bank of the United States was not. It functioned as the lender to the government. The bonds counted as reserves. It was very, I don't have all the details, but it was very much acted like a pseudo central bank. And that shouldn't have happened. There should have been competition. Anybody should have been allowed to open a bank, and they should have been able to get a national charter which would have allowed several national banks to compete with one another, rather than just one which basically acts like a central bank. All right, so let's go back to the questions. These are now questions unrelated to bank regulation or deregulation. A Necessant, what do you think about the economic situation here in Brazil and about the Brazilian Supreme Court trying to regulate, control social media? What do you suggest we do to improve the situation? Well, I mean, what you need to do is elect a Milei-like president and a Milei, like in Congress. You need to completely restructure the Brazilian economy. The Brazilian economy is a disaster. It's overly controlled, overly regulated, overly taxed, overly owned by too much government ownership of the means of production. It's too corrupt, too much corruption being facilitated. The Supreme Court needs to be neutered It has way too much power. It needs to be like the Supreme Court of the United States. It should not be a Supreme Court that actually can go out and basically write their own laws, which is what the Brazilian Supreme Court is doing. So Brazil needs a massive restructuring of its economy and of its political structure. And that's going to require a major revolution in thinking, and it's going to require somebody like Milei to really shake things up and rethink what's going on. Iron Meerkat, should you support turning the UN building into a Trump hotel if that's the price of having the UN kicked out of the US? Gaza must be destroyed. Sure, I'd support the UN building. I'd support the UN being kicked out of the US, and if we have to pay Trump a bribe by giving him the property, that's a cheap price to pay in order to get rid of the UN. Frank, I know you like Renaissance, the group Renaissance. The bass player, John Kemp, just died. Also can explain the Cave of the Patriarchs massacre. Who was Baruch Goldstein? God, I don't remember the details of that, but Baruch Goldstein was he was a religious nationalist nutcase who, if I remember right, came into a place of worship. I think this is during the Second Intifada, so in the early 2000s, when buses were blowing up all over the place and Israelis were being killed regularly by Palestinian terrorists, and just shot up a bunch of people who were praying and killed a lot of people, land up, I think, being arrested and put in jail. So that is the massacre, I think. And it was a horrible act of murder, of terrorism. And, he should have been put in jail and the keys thrown away. And I think that's actually what happened, unless he was killed. I can't remember. But, there are nutcases on the side of Israel as well. But that is not the rule. That is the exception. Michael says, I'm saving my mega questions for the end of the month Q&A show and the New Year Eve show. Okay. Thanks, Michael. Andrew, why wouldn't selfishness entail using the government to wield regulation for one's own interest? Because it's never in one's own interest to have the government wield force. The government wielding force is a granting of arbitrary force to the government, which is going to be wielded against you in one way or the other. And it harms your self-esteem to know that you are being successful because, let's say, you've managed to get the government to wield force against your competitor. So you are now damaging your own recognition, your own knowledge of your own productive ability. And you now know that you're a failure, that you can only be successful by wielding force. Basically, the government wielding force on your behalf is like you wielding force. It's the same reason why it's not in your self-interest to lie, cheat, and steal. It basically is an acknowledgement by yourself that you are incapable of using reason to survive, and therefore are incapable living a life of a human being, that you have to revert to being an animal in order to survive. That's what it means to use the government to wield force against your competitors, let's say. And that is never in your self-interest. Not to mention the fact that once you give the government the power to use force against your competitor, you're giving them the power to use force against you. Andrew, what do you think of this notion that Elon is politically active in order to help his businesses gain advantage? I mean, I don't think that is most of what's going on here. I don't think that is what dominates Elon's thinking. I don't think that dominates his incentive. I think he thinks it's fun. I think he has a certain belief that this is good for the country, that this is his responsibility. But I also think he's going to be there when relevant, to make sure that the interests of his businesses are not hurt. I think he'll be a voice, and he'll make sure to express himself in order to protect the interests of his business. And, the fact that the ban on investment in China disappeared from the bill that was passed by the House and the Senate yesterday to keep the government open, I'm sure was cheered on by Elon Musk, if not suggested by him to begin with. But I don't think that's the main reason or the sole reason he went into politics. But it's not absent. It's there as well. Philosophy at work. Maribens, what do you call a bunch of chess players bragging about their game in a hotel lobby? Chestnuts boasting in an open foyer. It's supposed to be funny, guys. I'm sure Mary Bands is laughing, but she's biased. All right. Chestnuts boasting in an open foyer. All right. Fen Hopper, final question, I think, for the show. What's the difference between Congress and Parliament? Does a Parliament have a House of Representatives equivalent to a Senate equivalent? I don't think so. I think Parliament is just one house. Well, the British have the House of Lords, which kind of acts like a Senate, maybe, supposedly, not really. I don't know if there's a difference. I don't know what the difference between Congress and a House and Parliament is. I really don't know. Have to look it up. Andrew, would you describe libertarianism as philosophy for free markets? No. As philosophically for free markets? No. Because anarchy is anti-free markets. And anarchy is part of libertarianism. I would describe libertarianism as a big tent with a lot of different views in it. Many of them pretending to be pro-free markets, but not actually. And certainly I wouldn't use philosophically in the description, because I don't think libertarianism is very philosophical. They think they're advocating for free markets, but they're not. All right, we will call it a day. Thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope there was some value in that. As I said, we'll do healthcare, immigration, China next. We'll probably come back to financial deregulation because there's so many things we, for example, didn't cover insurance. There's a lot of other things that we didn't cover. Oh, Frank has a $20 question. If people understood money's profitability and had a more active view of money, most regulations would be seen as limiting and weak. I think that's right, but in order to have that kind of view of money, they'd have to have a better view of morality. That is, they'd have to have a self-interested view of morality. They'd have to be thinkers as well. But yes, I mean, part of the need to the perceived need to regulate finance is this idea of money as barren, interest as basically stealing, not real wealth creation, not real creation. And therefore, we need protection from those evil guys that make money from money somehow magically. So the understanding money, understanding how money leads to more money, money leads to productivity, is a crucial piece in making people be okay with a true free market in money and banking and finance. All right, everybody. I will see you on Monday. Those of you who speak Hebrew, there will be a show tomorrow, 11 a.m. East Coast time. Otherwise, see you all Monday. Bye, everybody. Have a great rest of your weekend.